They found her at 0340, half buried in a snowdrift on the eastern slope of the Caucasus Range, her left hand still wrapped around a suppressor that had frozen to her palm. The rescue team, 3 men from the 10th Special Forces Group, who had been diverted from a separate operation 40 kilometers south, didn't know what they were looking at. Not at first. What they saw was a woman in white-gray tactical gear, unconscious, her body temperature so far below normal that the medic, a quiet Georgian-American named Sergeant Cavallo, later told his debrief officer he assumed she was dead. He said that twice. He needed to say it twice because the alternative, that she had survived 11 days alone at elevation, in January, in the eastern Caucasus, didn't fit inside anything he understood about human biology. What Cavallo didn't know, and wouldn't know for another 72 hours, was that the woman he was carrying down a mountain on a makeshift litter had just completed a shot that the ballistics community would argue about for the next decade. 3,844 meters. In a crosswind, at night. Her name was Ingrid Sauer. She was 31 years old. The problem with Ingrid Sauer, and there had always been a problem with Ingrid Sauer, according to the people who evaluated her, was that she thought too much. That was the phrase Commandant Brecker used in her third-year assessment at the Army Marksmanship Unit. She thinks too much. He meant it as a criticism. He wrote it as a criticism. In the margin of the assessment, beneath the official scoring columns where Sauer had placed first in every measurable category, Brecker had added a handwritten note. Overthinks the shot. Calcoats when she should feel. What Brecker didn't understand, and what Sauer had long since stopped trying to explain to men like him, was that the thinking was the shot. The mathematics wasn't a delay, it was the mechanism. Ingrid had grown up in a household that operated on numbers the way other households operated on routine. Her father had been an applied physicist at Johns Hopkins. Her mother had taught graduate-level fluid dynamics at the same university for 22 years. The dinner table in their Baltimore row house was a chalkboard. Not metaphorically, literally. Her father had mounted a 6-foot section of slate on the dining room wall. When Ingrid was 4 years old, and every meal was accompanied by equations the way other families were accompanied by television. By the time she was 9, Ingrid could calculate projectile drag without a calculator. By 14, she understood atmospheric refraction well enough to correct for it in her head. By 17, she had won 3 national shooting championships in the junior division and had quietly begun to understand something that no one around her seemed to want to acknowledge. The human body, at its extreme limits, becomes a measurement instrument. The question was whether you trusted the data it produced. She enlisted at 22. Not because she lacked options. Johns Hopkins had offered her a full scholarship to their applied mathematics program, but because she had read a declassified field report about a failed Overwatch mission in Syria, and something in that document, some specific failure of calculation at a specific moment of consequence, had lodged in her mind and refused to leave. She wanted to be in rooms where the mathematics mattered absolutely. The Army, to its credit, recognized what it had. The Army, also to its credit, had no idea what to do with it. She had been in Azerbaijan for 9 days before the mission changed. The original assignment was straightforward. Provide overwatch for a meeting between a U.S. diplomatic attaché and a mid-level official from the Georgian Defense Ministry. The meeting was in Shiki, a city in the country's northwest, close enough to the Russian border that the embassy had insisted on a security detail. Sauer had been attached to that detail as the long-range element, positioned on a ridge above the meeting site with a line of sight to every approach road. The meeting happened without incident. She was already packing her equipment when Major Halverson reached her on the encrypted line. Halverson was the kind of officer who delivered information the way a surgeon delivers a diagnosis. Cleanly, without warmth, with the implicit understanding that your feelings about the information were not his concern. He told Sauer that a signal's intercept from the previous 48 hours had identified a man named Radovan Kretz in the Caucasus Range northeast of their current position. He told her that Kretz was wanted in connection with the sale of decommissioned Soviet-era guidance systems to 3 separate buyers, at least one of whom the intelligence community believed was affiliated with a group that had killed 11 American servicemen in a Kabul marketplace 18 months earlier. He told her that conventional extraction of Kretz was not possible given the current diplomatic situation with Russia, that Georgian authorities had been informed but lacked the ground assets to reach the area within the relevant window, and that the intelligence had a shelf life of approximately 72 hours. He told her that she had been selected because of her file. Then he told her what the distance would be if the intelligence was accurate. Sauer didn't say anything for a long moment. "That's not confirmed," she said finally. "No," Halverson said. "It's a best estimate based on available terrain data and last known position." "Best estimate," she repeated. "Yes." She looked out at the mountain range to the northeast. The last light was leaving the sky, turning the snow on the upper slopes the color of old bone. "I need the atmospheric data for the past 6 hours," she said. "Wind readings at every elevation interval you have. Barometric, temperature gradient, everything." "Understood," Halverson said. "And I need to do my own calculation. I don't want your team's number. I want mine." There was a pause. That's fine. One more thing. Go ahead. If I call this untenable, we pull back. No second guessing, no mission creep. If I run the numbers and this isn't makeable, I say so and that's the end of it." Another pause. "Longer." "Agreed," said Halverson. She shouldered her pack and began moving northeast. The climb took 2.5 days. This is not a dramatic exaggeration. The terrain between Shiki and the ridge above Kretz's identified position involved 1,100 meters of elevation gain over 17 kilometers of ground that alternated between ice-covered scree, dense coniferous forest, and exposed granite faces where the wind came off the Russian steppe with enough force to push a person sideways. Sauer moved at night when the temperatures dropped to levels that most cold-weather survival training would categorize as dangerous for sustained exertion. She moved at night because the thermal signatures were quieter, because she had run the detection risk calculus and determined that nighttime movement reduced the probability of compromise by roughly 60%, and because she had grown up in a household that had taught her, above all else, to trust the data. She ate twice. She slept in 90-minute intervals in a bivvy that reduced her thermal output to near ambient. She recalculated her atmospheric numbers every 4 hours as the conditions changed, updating a physical notebook she kept in the interior pocket of her jacket, the one place where body heat was reliably retained. By the morning of the third day, she was positioned on a rock outcropping at 3,200 meters elevation, looking northeast through a night force optic at a valley that was still in deep shadow. She checked her notebook. The window, based on the wind pattern she had been tracking, would be sometime between 2,100 and 2,300 that evening. The valley floor would be lit by a quarter moon, which was insufficient for most purposes, but sufficient for hers. The crosswind at the intermediate elevation points, which mattered as much as the wind at her position, because a bullet traveling that distance spent most of its flight in air she couldn't directly measure, had been averaging 6.2 meters per second from the northwest, with gusts to 9. She spent the next 14 hours on the outcropping, motionless except for the small adjustments required to maintain circulation. She ate half a ration bar. She drank measured amounts of water that she melted from snow in a collapsible container she kept inside her jacket. She thought about the mathematics. Not in the way Commandant Brecker had meant when he said she thinks too much. Not as a delay or a distraction. She thought about it the way her father had thought about fluid dynamics at the dinner table, the way you think about a problem that is yours to solve, that belongs to you, that has a real answer waiting inside it. The bullet, once fired, would be in the air for approximately 11 seconds. 11 seconds is a long time. In 11 seconds, a crosswind of 6.2 meters per second moves an object laterally by a distance that compounds non-linearly across the trajectory because the wind's effect is greatest when the bullet's velocity is lowest, which is at the end of its flight. The Earth's rotation exerts a measurable effect at that distance. The Coriolis effect, typically dismissed at ranges under 2 kilometers, becomes a significant variable above 3. The temperature differential between her position and the valley floor was substantial enough to affect the bullet's ballistic coefficient as it passed through the transitional air layer between mountain and valley. Every one of these variables had a number. Every number was calculable. She ran through them for the 14th time as the sun dropped behind the western ridge. At 21:17, she acquired the target. At 21:34, the wind settled into a consistent pattern for the first time in 6 hours. She exhaled halfway. She stopped. She fired once. 11 seconds is a long time. She knew the result before any confirmation was possible, the way you know the answer to an equation before you've checked it. Not from confidence in herself, but from confidence in the numbers. The numbers had been right. She had worked them carefully enough that they had to be right. She did not stay to verify. Staying was not the mission. The mission was to leave no trace of having been there, which meant moving immediately, which meant folding the bivvy, securing the brass, and beginning the descent on the northern face where the wind had scoured the snow into a hard crust that would hold no footprint. She was moving within 4 minutes. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that a 3-man security element that had not appeared in any of the intelligence she had been given was positioned on the ridge she needed to cross to reach the extraction route. She found out about them at 22:09, when a tripwire sensor she had not placed activated 40 meters behind her. She had 1 second to process the sound. She used it correctly. The next 9 days were what the debrief documentation would later call an unplanned extended field stay, which is the kind of phrase that institutional language produces when the actual phrase, "She was hunted across a mountain range in January by men who had orders to ensure she didn't survive," is too direct for official records. What happened specifically was this. Sauer evaded the initial contact by moving upslope rather than down, which was the opposite of what the 3-man element expected, because moving upslope in those conditions was not a rational choice. It was not a rational choice because the upper slope, above 3,400 meters, offered no cover, no shelter, and temperatures that at night dropped to levels that caused standard cold weather gear to fail. It was not a rational choice, and that was exactly why she chose it. She had learned, over 9 years of operating in environments that punished predictable behavior, that the irrational choice was often the survivable one because the people hunting you were running the same probability calculations you were. If you behaved predictably, you were solving for the same answer they were. The irrational choice broke the equation. She moved upslope for 4 hours. She found a rock overhang near 3,600 meters that provided minimal shelter and used it. She did not sleep. She cataloged her resources. She had approximately 60 hours of nutrition if rationed to survival minimums. Enough water if she continued melting snow. Her radio, which had been compromised. She had heard them on her frequency within the first hour, which told her someone had pulled her operational details, which told her the compromise had happened before she left Shiki. Her weapon, minus what she had expended, a physical notebook with 11 days of atmospheric calculations. She did not have a way out that involved retracing her route. She did not have air support, because requesting air support on a compromised channel was the same as sending a location beacon to the people hunting her. What she had was time and mathematics. She spent the first 2 days simply staying alive and staying unfindable, moving in unpredictable intervals, at unpredictable times, never staying in any position long enough for a methodical search pattern to locate her. She studied the movement patterns of the element hunting her. There were more than 3 now, which told her the initial security team had called for reinforcement, which told her Kretz had been more important to someone than the intelligence had suggested. By the 4th day, she had mapped their search pattern well enough to identify its structural weakness. Every search pattern has one. This one's weakness was a communications relay point on the southwestern ridge, a position they returned every 6 hours, because it was the only place in the terrain where their radio equipment functioned reliably. She could identify it by the timing of their movements. She could not eliminate the relay point directly, but she could use its location. She began moving in a direction that made no apparent sense given the terrain, a long arc to the north that added significant distance and exposure to any extraction route. She moved that direction because it was the one direction the search pattern was not covering. They had calculated it as non-viable, and because the mathematics of her fuel consumption told her she needed to reach lower elevation within 3 days, or the nutrition deficit would begin affecting her cognitive function. She reached 2,200 meters on the 7th day. Her hands were not working properly. This was not a figure of speech. The fine motor coordination required to operate a trigger precisely had been degraded by cold exposure to a measurable degree, and she knew this, and she accounted for it, and she kept moving. On the 9th day, in a narrow river valley at 1,800 meters, she found a structure, not a shelter, a single-room stone building that had served as a shepherd's seasonal hut and was currently unoccupied. She stayed there for 11 hours. She slept for 6 of them in intervals. She ate the last of her rations. She wrote 5 pages of calculations in her notebook, not because they were needed now, but because writing kept her mind operational. She emerged from the hut at 0200 on the 11th day and began walking southwest. 2 hours later, she heard a helicopter. She did not move toward it. She did not signal it. She waited in the tree line and evaluated the aircraft's flight pattern and determined, based on the search grid it was running, that it was American. Then she stepped into the open and lit her emergency strobe, which she had been carrying for 9 days and had not used because she had not trusted, until that moment, that American meant safe. The helicopter was from the 10th Special Forces Group. The medic was Cavallo. He thought she was dead. She was not dead. She was, however, not fully functional, and the medical team at Incirlik Air Base, where she was transported after an initial assessment, determined she was stable enough for airlift, spent 6 hours addressing the specific damage that 11 days at elevation in January had inflicted on a human body that had been asked to remain operational past the point where most human bodies would have simply stopped. She didn't speak much during those 6 hours. There wasn't a great deal to say that could be said in a room with medical personnel and 3 intelligence officers who were already asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. She asked for her notebook. It was in her jacket, which had been removed. One of the intelligence officers, a man named Perrin, looked at the notebook as if he was deciding whether to withhold it. She watched his face. She said, "That notebook is mine and it stays with me." Perrin gave her the notebook. She held it against her side and said nothing else until she was alone. The debrief began on the 3rd day, when the medical staff confirmed she was cognitively functional enough to participate. Major Halverson flew in from Tbilisi. There were 2 other people in the room whose names she was not given, and whose affiliation she inferred from context, as belonging to an organization that operated in the space between official DoD channels and the things that DoD officially acknowledged. Halverson began the debrief the way debriefs are supposed to begin, chronologically, methodically, without editorial. He stopped being methodical about 40 minutes in. The issue was the distance. The confirmed distance, established by the terrain mapping data and the location of the confirmed site, was 3,844 meters. This was not the number that had been given to her in Shiki. The number she had been given was a best estimate based on available terrain data. That estimate had been short by a significant margin. "You knew it was different," Halverson said. "It was not a question." "I ran my own calculation," Sauer said. "I know. I'm asking if you knew the original estimate was wrong." She looked at him. "I knew it was an estimate. I ran mine, and your number was the right number." There was a silence in the room. One of the unnamed men shifted in his chair. "The shot was confirmed," Halverson said. "I know," Sauer said, "at 3,844 meters at night, in a crosswind. I know what the conditions were," she said. "I was there." Halverson looked at her for a long moment. He had been in the Army for 23 years. He had debriefed hundreds of operational personnel. He said later, in a conversation that was not officially recorded, but which circulated in the relevant communities anyway, that in 23 years, he had never sat across from someone who discussed a shot at that distance the way other people discuss a calculation they worked out on a napkin. Not with pride, not with discomfort, with the equanimity of a person who had done a thing correctly and understood exactly why it had been correct. "The notebook," he said. "The one you wouldn't give up." "Yes. What's in it?" She opened it on the table. Pages of numbers, written in pencil, in a hand that remained precise even after 9 days in the Caucasus. Atmos pressure readings at 6-hour intervals across 11 days. Wind speed and direction at multiple elevation bands. Temperature gradients, Coriolis correction factors adjusted for latitude. bullet velocity decay curves, holdover calculations, margin of error ranges for every variable updated every time new data was available. The unnamed man on the left leaned forward. He looked at the pages for a while. "You did this by hand," he said. "Yes, in the field. Yes." He sat back. He looked at Halverson. Something passed between them that Sauer didn't have enough context to interpret, but which she filed away, because she filed everything away. "Specialist Sauer," Halverson said, and then he paused, and then he used a different word. "The people who compromised your operational channel before you left Shiki. We have reason to believe that came from inside the diplomatic mission." She had already concluded this. She said nothing. "The individuals responsible are being identified." Still nothing. "I want to be clear about something," Halverson said. He looked at her directly. "You were sent on a mission with corrupted intelligence over a compromised channel without knowledge that the security situation at the target had changed significantly from what you were briefed. You were then hunted for 9 days by people who had details of your operational profile that could only have come from someone with access to mission planning documents." He paused. "And you completed the mission." "I noticed," said Sauer. One of the unnamed men made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Halverson's expression didn't change, but something in it did. "We'd like to talk about what comes next," he said. "I'd like medical clearance first," Sauer said. "And sleep. And I want the people responsible for the channel compromise identified before I agree to any conversation about what comes next." "I'm not asking," she said, quietly, the way her mother used to say things at the dinner table when the equation was settled and the discussion was over. "I'm telling you what the terms are." Halverson looked at her. He nodded once. "All right," he said. "The people responsible for the channel compromise were identified within 6 weeks. There were 3 of them. One was a signals officer attached to the Tbilisi embassy who had been passing operational details to a private security contractor with ties to the Kretz network for 19 months. The other 2 were further up a chain that the investigation followed carefully. Through layers of contracting, relationships, and financial transactions, into a space that the official record would later describe as a network of relationships inconsistent with the obligations of their respective position. The signals officer was prosecuted. The other 2 were not, because the other 2 were in positions that made prosecution complicated in ways that the relevant oversight committees were not at the time prepared to navigate publicly. Sauer was told about the outcomes. She listened. She asked specific questions about what documentation existed regarding the financial relationships and whether that documentation was complete and where it was held and who had access to it. She was told that this was an ongoing matter. She said that she understood, and she wrote down what she had been told, and she asked for the meeting to end. There is a version of this story where the notebook matters because of what it accomplished, the shot, the numbers. The calculation that put a bullet at 3,844 meters under conditions that the relevant community will argue about for years. There is another version where the notebook matters because of what it survived. 9 days, 3 search teams, temperatures that degraded everything except the pencil marks on the pages, because pencil on paper does not require batteries or signals or infrastructure. It requires only the person who made the marks and the mind that made them. The relevant community spent a great deal of time in the months afterward focused on the first version. The distance, the conditions, whether it was repeatable, whether the Coriolis correction she had applied was the right one, whether the atmospheric model she had built in a field notebook over 11 days in the Caucasus was a valid methodology or an extraordinary accident. These were interesting questions. They were not the question Ingrid Sauer thought mattered. The question she thought mattered was why the intelligence had been wrong in ways that specifically endangered the person executing the mission, and why the channel had been compromised in ways that specifically endangered the person executing the mission, and what precisely the relationship was between Radovan Kretz and the people who had decided those 2 facts didn't need to be disclosed to her before she left. She kept the notebook. She kept the calculations. She kept the documentation she had requested from the debrief officers, which they had provided more completely than they probably intended to, because the questions she asked were precise, and the people answering them underestimated how much precision mattered in documentation the same way it mattered at 844 meters in a crosswind. Some truths she had learned a long time ago at a dinner table with slate on the wall don't come from feeling. They come from doing the math until the answer is unavoidable. She had time, she had the notebook, she had the numbers. She started from the beginning.